We're going to go straight into the address by the Honorable Minister of Education, who is someone who, anybody who has paid attention to education policy in Jamaica will know that Minister Holness has spent a considerable part of his life thinking about and addressing education issues, and of course, the last couple of years having political responsibility for education.
Thank you very much, Damian, my former lecturer. And I must acknowledge that because much of what I know about economics, which is not much, but sufficient to find my way through policy, I learned in those macroeconomic classes. And I don't think I was such a bad student, was I? But I've employed some of what I've learned in those classes to education policy. And one thing we are certain of is that for education policy, any policy in education, to be successful, we must first of all start with accountability. And that is the agents who are responsible for the structure, design, implementation, monitoring, and review, and indeed operation of policy. All the agents in that process must be held to explain or to acknowledge why the policy worked or why it didn't work. We more so look at accountability, of course, in the negative, why the policy did not work. One of the first challenges I faced in trying to develop a policy around accountability was how to deal with a culture that did not accept accountability in education. One of the first things we acknowledged, of course, was that because there was this unevenness in the distribution of resources in the education sector, the agents in the sector were very wary of taking on responsibilities for functions for which they were not properly resourced. So there was a standoff. Teachers and principals would say, look, you can't ask me to deliver on a policy or meet a performance target when you did not provide me with the resources to do it. So that was part of the consideration that underpinned the reluctance, skepticism about putting in place a system of accountability within education. Of course, within the broad education landscape, parents have been holding schools accountable long before the ministry decided that it would implement a general policy for holding agents in education accountable for performance. But we see that where parental involvement is low, then the accountability that the school is held to, or the agents in education are held to, that accountability is usually non-existent. So, in terms of a strategy, the Ministry of Education, one, is looking at empowering parents, because parents are a critical stakeholder in ensuring accountability. And they will work outside of, parallel, and indeed because they have a vested interest, they will ensure that schools meet targets. The ministry has a vested interest as well, because we want to ensure that the resources that we spend, that they are used in the most efficient way. So one, we put forward the point that whatever we do in accountability, in terms of managing, measuring, recording, giving information, that it must be done in such a way as to acknowledge from the outset the resources that the schools were given or the agents in the field were given. And by that we mean we must take a value-added approach. So we acknowledge what you have, and that's your starting point. But we want to see how efficiently you have used what little you have been given. And that is the starting point for our strategy for accountability. It answers the question that has always been asked by the agents and the schools: how can we do what you want us to do with the little resources you have provided us? So we start by saying, well, even if we provide you with insufficient resources, show us how efficiently you have used those resources. That's number one. Number two, once we start to talk about accountability, we start to talk about measurements and setting targets. So there must be a participatory approach to target setting. So it can't be a top-down, that this is a target, it is inflexible. It must acknowledge where you are and where you could possibly go based upon where you started. So we have assured the agents in education and the schools that the targets that are being set are targets that are set in a, I don't want to use the word democratic, but in a participatory way, that you have a say in the target that you're going to be held accountable for, and that we acknowledge the base from which you started. Of course, the other part of accountability is deciding on the sanctions for non-performance or the sanctions for failing to meet the target. That part of it we haven't fully resolved. But the current Education Act speaks to something called the inefficiency of the teacher as grounds for separation